Douglas Murray. You are a best-selling author and an award-winning journalist. And thanks for taking the time today to be here with me in Copenhagen. We are airing from the city of Copenhagen, and you are here because your book, The Strange Death of Europe, has just been translated into Danish. And at the same time, the Danish Free Press Society has awarded you with the Sappho Prize, which you received yesterday at an event taking place in the Danish Parliament. And congratulations with the prize. I was very excited to read your book because it really stands apart, because it discusses the existential dimension of the entire issue with immigration and Islamization. And to me, it seems, and that's why I've been looking so much forward to talk to you today, because I don't think many commentators really has picked up on this issue with the existential dimension. And to me, it seems that the decline of Christianity in the West has created a spiritual and a moral vacuum of enormous proportions. And in this vacuum, or it is this vacuum that actually gives Islam or Islamism momentum and nourishment. So sometimes I have thought about that Europe could be compared to the empty house that Jesus talks about in the Gospel of Luke. I don't know if you remember the passage.
Remind me.
But Jesus talks about a return of the unclean spirit. And it says that when the unclean spirit returns to the home it finds it swept, tidied, and then it goes off and bring 7 other spirits more wicked than itself. And they go in and set up the house there. So the situation ends up being worse than it was before.
Right.
And I think it is an image that can be translated into that when we turned our back on God and emptied our house, so to say, Islam came and knocked on our doors and they want to move in. I think this is quite a good image of what's happening in Europe today. So I think it was Jung, the psychiatrist, who said that when good is suppressed, it will come back in demonic form. What do you make of all this? Do you agree with me that we have this empty house and now Islam wants to move in, and it is actually the core problem?
Well, there's a lot there. I think, to stick with your analogy there, yes, we're certainly one of the things that would like to move in. I think it's the most assertive one that would like to move in and knows what it would do if it had control of the house, which makes it different from some of the other things that are moving in, which I'm not sure have anything like as clear a set of presumptions, ambitions, potential achievements in mind. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of what I would think of as the sort of new religions that are being developed at the moment on the radical left. Social justice warriorism, people who think that politics is a sort of form of radical activist politics is a type of replacement for religion. I mean, that's obviously moving in most people's daily lives, by the way, in Europe. That one, the sort of radical social justice warrior type, probably has a bigger influence on their daily life at the moment than Islam does, in that if you don't trip over it, for a lot of people, Islam is able to be kept in the background. You know, they can live in different areas, they can move, all these sorts of things, whereas the social justice warriorism is making its way through every institution, every company, and so on. But these are obviously very different things, but they're all attracted to the vacuum, for sure. And they all have different ambitions, more and less developed. But yes, they have that thing in common, which is, I said some months ago at a discussion in the O2 Arena in London with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, I said to Sam then that one of the things that's been much on my mind in recent years has been the concern that we may be in the process of discovering that the only thing worse than religion is its absence. And this is on my mind all the time. I mean, it's...
But even though you're right that social justice warriors are moving into the empty house as well, I mean, Islam comes with a religion.
Sure.
They don't.
Well, no.
And that's what we have to deal with.
And that's not quite true, because it's not a developed religion, but it's got all the hallmarks, all the makings, all the aspirations, all of the pseudo dogmas that any other religion could come up with. I mean, they haven't worked hard enough on it yet, but my God, they're going to try. I mean, they're trying to square the circle. They're trying to come up with theories and with dogmas. And to that extent, I just say that, as I say, that Islam is obviously a very developed religion. I mean, it's been going for 1400 years. It's done a lot, whichever way you look at it, globally. This has only been, the social justice warriorism has only been around for a couple of decades. But as I say, I mean, it clearly plays towards the religious impulse, is the point I'm trying to make. And to that extent, might be better understood as something which panders to religion rather than towards politics as we've generally understood it.
But it's still a substitute, whereas
Sure.
You say that Islam is a developed religion.
Yeah, I mean, a moderately bright young person could easily think their way out of social justice warriorism by noticing the contradictions and not falling for the post-Marxist idea that the contradictions are the point. Okay, so that's how you'd get out of it if you were a moderately bright young person. If you were brought up within Islam, not to mention anything about converts for the time being, but if you were brought up within Islam, that's a much harder thing, because it's actually a whole culture as well. It's very hard to extrapolate where the religion and the culture divide. So you'd be leaving everything, as well as pretty much, as I know from many people I've spoken to over the years from around the world who've apostatized from the religion of Islam, you'd also be losing everyone. And that's a lot to demand of an individual.
But isn't the problem that we are not willing to address the issue of religion, and we haven't really even been thinking about that, our absence of religion,
No.
the lack of our Christian faith, or that we have abandoned it, could invite another religion to take over?
Yes, I mean, this is my basic critique of the pure Enlightenment rationalist movement, which is, at the very least, recognize what you're missing. And it's not like the things that they're missing are small. They include some of the most basic human instincts, such as the instinct, the desire to find meaning in life. Most of the rationalists, secularists, Enlightenment thinkers, this isn't a critique of the main part of their philosophy and the point, but the thing that they are not able to address is very large. And I think that's a failure that should have been recognized a long time ago. I think I referred to in the book, but I've certainly referred to in other times in public, are Habermas, who's, I think, in some ways an unimportant thinker. But I think one of the things he's done which is important is that essay from some years ago called An Awareness of What's Missing, where at least he tries to put his finger on it when he talks about this funeral of a friend in Germany, which is in a church without a priest and no amen. But he says that his late friend seemed to be saying, we haven't yet come up with anything to replace and recognize the seriousness of this moment. So although I don't believe it, I'm going to at least do it in the same area because that's as close as we've got.
But I think even there is an enormous unawareness that this absence of values and faith is actually what has made this crisis that we are in now. Because it's very popular to blame it on the politicians, blame it on Islam. Sure. It's always blaming the others, whereas we never really consider whether we have a problem that actually has just opened up a kind of, like I said, we have created this empty household because we kicked everything out.
Right.
That used to be our foundations. And suddenly we're so surprised that somebody else tries to move in.
Yes, I agree with part of that. I mean, well, here's the sort of harder conundrum of where we are, though. Believers, I think, like yourself, will tend to take the attitude towards non-believers that the non-believers aren't trying in some way. And I think that it's worse than that, or at least much more complex than that. That it's not just that non-believers are trying to put off some serious decision or something. It's that for a range of reasons, I might say, we can't. This is the moment that is so striking in Michel Houellebecq's Submission, is the moment when he travels south and sits in front of the Black Madonna, desperate for a sign, desperate for an event. He wants something to happen.
A kind of connection.
A connection. He wants a conversion-like moment. He's that open and up for it, and nothing happens. And I think that's such a profound passage that in the book, and almost no other modern novelist would have been able to have come to that. You could see how a Catholic novelist like Evelyn Waugh might have allowed a miracle to occur. And I think there's something very important about Houellebecq's decision to make sure that the conversion doesn't occur, however much it's wished for.
Why do you think it doesn't occur?
Well, why it doesn't occur for the novelist's purposes, or why it doesn't occur, let's say, to pretend that the novel was true. Let me take those in order. For the novelist's purposes, it's a much more important question to open up, because it says that you could hope for wild grace as much as you like, but if nothing's there, then there's nothing there. For the reason why nothing happens, it's either that there's nothing there, or that there's some other reason. And the some other reasons would have different explanations between the religious and the non-religious. The religious would obviously say that there's a reason that, you can't force the hand of God, or you can't propel like
maybe
that.
He was not willing to give up his identity, his self-ownership, or repent of his sins, if we're talking in a Christian terminology. Maybe he just doesn't want to. Maybe because this is the way I read the novel, is that he simply doesn't want to surrender. He just simply does not want to.
Yes, I read that differently. I read that he really did by that point. He had, as the reader knows, an awful lot of sex, an awful lot of fun, would have been at precisely the right moment to give up the pleasures he'd got tired of. So he would have been, in my view, in an eminently good place to convert. But nothing happens. And I think, along with that Habermas point, I think what Houellebecq does there is just, at the very least, a highly accurate pinpoint of where a lot of us, I include myself in this, that I describe in the book, that a lot of us find ourselves in. We can't unlearn what we've learned. It's true that every time science takes over an area of religion, we don't go back to the religious explanation. You know, like once you've made neurological discoveries, the neurological discoveries don't then hand over back to some biblical understanding of why some people go mad. You know, it's only ever an acquisition of land in one direction.
But how come that people who belong to the Muslim faith, who belongs to Islam, they can cope with both? I mean, they can deal with both science and their religion. How come that we cannot anymore?
I'm not sure they do, actually. I'm not at all sure they do. Either in the West or certainly not in the Islamic world. I don't think that in Pakistan people have particularly accepted the discoveries of science.
But they're using science, so to say.
Ah, yes. Well, they're exactly.
It's part of the world. It's part of the world. So they don't have a problem with science.
I think I don't want to be too sweeping about the opinions of 1.6 billion people or whatever it is, but I'd be amazed if it's the case that a serious amount of thought has been given as to why so much that Allah says is so incorrect.
But you have so many terrorists that really have high educations from university.
Right.
And they still hold on to their religious beliefs, even though that they are highly educated. You have a lot of highly educated people that are very radicalized. So it doesn't mean that you cannot be enlightened and you cannot adapt to the modern world and not have a religious worldview.
Let me tell you what I think from a lot of Muslims I've spoken to is the case, is that you segment out your brain on this. That a part of you accepts that certain things have happened, certain discoveries have been made, but you don't want to look into them all that much. I remember having some of that when I was a believing Christian, that I knew there were certain areas I didn't particularly want to look into because I thought if I looked into them, they would be highly destructive of my faith. Mm-hmm. And I was right.
But what if...
And I think just to finish that thought, a lot of Muslims I have spoken to have exactly that. Now, there are ways you get around it in the interim. Nothing happens that Allah doesn't will, can get you a very long way. But the discoveries of Darwin have got almost nowhere into the Islamic world. The very, very starting points of it are occurring.
But what if our position when it comes to science and religion the consequence will be that Islam is taking over more and more because we simply don't have any kind of answer to their faith because we lost our faith. It means that we don't speak the religious language anymore. And it seems so when you look at the statistics that radicalization is growing everywhere in Europe. It means that our approach with science and non-faith and the secular worldview simply just makes people more radical and even more religious. That it seems that our secularism is actually triggering their religious beliefs. So what if actually we are in a kind of situation where we are being defeated by faith, even though we think that we are so enlightened?
Well, look, it's obviously a big advantage to have a totalistic explanation. It's a very big advantage. In the same way that if you said to me you were uncertain about certain questions, and I said there's nothing about which I don't have complete understanding, I would be at an advantage, whether I was making it up or not. And religions do provide total explanations. And there's no doubt about it that the secular worldview that says we will war on that, then clear it out, and get on with being happy liberals, has, as I say, as Habermas, as Welbeck, as many other people are starting to point out, leaves massive, massive hole, what I describe as the void. And the void has to be addressed. And I think there's a very specific reason why it isn't addressed by secular thinkers. It's because they know about it, but they don't know what to do to address it.
Exactly.
So they would rather avoid the question.
Yeah.
And I say, I think you can't avoid the question.
Or they turn political ideologies into a substitute for religion, like you mentioned in the beginning. To me, it seems that people or the human beings are hardwired for some kind of religious explanation. And if you don't have God, you will turn something else into God.
Well, I would say it's something that's almost the case. I think we are hardwired to believe that there is a meaning, that we are not just collections of atoms meaninglessly flooding around a meaningless universe. I think it's very, very hard for us to think that that is actually the case, whether it is the case or not.
But this is our ideology for the time being.
I'm not sure it is, because very few people are willing to put it like that. I mean, people are told they have purpose to be the best person they can be today, or the best person they can be.
There is no transcendence in it.
But well, my point is that if almost nobody says there is basically no point to, it's very hard to live as a complete nihilist. It's very hard to live as somebody who actually believes that there's absolutely no purpose to what we're doing. Now, the crossroads then is, are we hardwired to believe there is meaning and there is meaning, or are we simply meaning-searching beings and there may be no meaning? Now, if we are meaning-seeking beings, it's probably a very bad idea to say we are meaning-seeking beings and there is no meaning. That if you get hit by a bus today, the people around you who loved you will be sad, but that's it. It was going to happen to somebody. It's going to happen to you at some point that you're going to die.
But
so don't worry about it anymore. Now, something intrinsic in us tells us that our lives are not as purposeless as that. But the big void that it opens up is then, what are we doing? And the only thing that can answer that, as I see it, are religions. That doesn't mean that religions are true. It doesn't mean that specific religions are true. But there's no doubt about it, I completely concede the point that the only thing that can address that fully is going to be a religion.
I think even Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, he said that Christianity was the best defense against Islam, and he's an atheist. He said that. I guess he has come to the conclusion that religion actually is providing meaning and a lot of values, which secularism doesn't do the same way.
Well, there was that question that a friend of Richard Dawkins and mine, and Christopher Hitchens, used to pose on his anti-God tour that he, did so amazingly towards the end of his life. There was that question that Christopher always used to pose, which was, tell me one good thing that a believer can do that a non-believer can't. And actually nobody ever got round to answering his question. Everyone avoided it. Every rabbi and vicar, and not many imams would ever quite understandably debate him, but nobody ever answered it. And he ended up answering it himself, which is that there are some acts of, I would think of them as heroic love, often for somebody that you don't need to, in any normal circumstance, express heroic love for, which can only come in a Christian context. the Christian martyr from the 20th century who volunteered himself in place of a Jew to go to the death camp, who was made into a saint not long ago. Maximilian Kolbe.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example. I mean, there's no reason in a non-Christian context for a secular liberal person to say, take me. There's no reason.
No, you need a higher cause.
You'd have to have a higher cause.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously the most extreme example from the last century, the most extraordinary. But you could say that there are examples from within there that likewise are not able to be performed unless propelled by that belief. I didn't know that Richard Dawkins had used that, had argued that about Christianity. My experience is generally that non-believers are very, very wary about approaching the possibility that the Christian faith could be useful in order to help keep away another faith. They tend to be aware that it seems to be a devilish pact in their view. But it's very striking if he's admitted that.
I think it is an acknowledgement that the void really just makes things worse when it comes to Islam. Because the big irony here is that Islam is actually a perfect religion to enter Europe right now, because we have all created all this mess with the broken families, the divorces, the loneliness.
Don't let's forget that, I mean, broken families are a big specialism in the Islamic world as well.
I know, but still they have the idea of the big family. And it turns out that many actually have started to convert, especially women.
Yes.
Recently we saw that the Irish singer Sinead O'Connor just converted to Islam.
Sinead O'Connor, they can have her.
But I think...
of course, also it means she can't sing anymore, which would be a blessed relief. Music's out. That was one of the best things when Cat Stevens converted. At least people didn't happen to listen to his wretched crooning. Well, for a long time. No, to be serious, by the way, I mean, the Sinead O'Connor one is quite interesting because my friend Julie Birchall, a British journalist, had a lovely phrase about this. She said, she used it in a piece where she referenced me at The Spectator a couple of days ago, where she said that she thought that basically women who converted to Islam came from the same pool of women as those ones who write to mass murderers in prison asking them if they'll marry them. There is such a pool of women, let's face it, who play very strange, dark stuff, who are attracted to very dark things. I don't say that every woman who converts to Islam is that, but it's the most peculiar totalitarian thought system to put yourself into voluntarily.
Recently there was a documentary on Danish television about 3 women that had converted to Islam.
All Danes?
Yeah, all Danes. Just not ordinary women, young girls, young women. And they were not marrying any Muslim men. And they explained why they had chosen to convert. And that was very striking because they all came from messy backgrounds, which most people do today. I mean, they were in divorced families and they have had... And a problem was too much alcohol, partying too much, like, you know, every young person would have in Denmark, so to say. And they just, you know, they were looking for structure, rituals and rules and a higher meaning of life. And also they were looking for, you know, the big family and traditional gender roles. And I think Islam is perfect to come and clean up this mess that we have made because, you know, this kind of, you know, that we have dissolved all our values and there is no truth and we are questioning all the time whether there is a purpose of life or if there is any meaning. And suddenly you have Islam that has an answer to everything.
Sure.
And we don't have an answer to all these things. So it's very easy for young people and for people in all ages that wants to have rules. And, you know, we already have all those self-help books. So here are, you know, more rules to follow and you'll have the prospect of eternal life. There is an afterlife. There is a meaning of life.
Yeah.
So I think it's very striking that we see, 70% of all the converts are women that are choosing this by their own free will.
Yeah, by the way, it's their free will to convert if they want, but it's everyone else's free will to point out they're damn fools for doing so if they want as well. You're right that Islam could be in a position to come in and mop up. It would be the worst imaginable janitor. It's the worst possible person to do that job.
But if we don't provide anything else...
Well, it's like a totalitarian fascist system could clean up a lot of problems we have as well.
But that's our fault.
But it would be absolutely hell and nightmarish. And I would say the same thing about the Islamic mop up.
But my point is that we created the situation because we abandoned our roots, our Christian roots. So we actually created this situation.
It's possible. I think that one of the reasons why is that we find it extremely hard to dance on the precarious edge that we've created. And some people find it impossible. So that I've been very interested for some years and spoken to a number of people who have converted, and particularly women. And they have exactly the experience that you've just described with the 3 women in the Danish documentary. My experience is that it tends to happen in their late 20s, early 30s, a bit earlier than Sinead O'Connor, a bit later than the young women in this documentary. And pretty much it goes something like this. They are at a certain stage in life, they're very drunk one evening in a nightclub or something like that, or throwing up in a gutter, and they just think, what the hell am I doing? There must be more to my life than this. And the thing is, they're obviously right. Obviously they're right that there's more to life than this. There's more to life than just seeking pleasure and getting pissed and meeting the wrong man and not getting on and being unhappy and potentially being lonely and seeing your entire future as a replay of exactly the last 24 hours. They're right to fear that, but what I find amazing in it is that in these cases, is that the thing when they reach out and they find Islam. I find that amazing. And a number of people I've spoken to over the years who have this is like they actually do a kind of shop around. They actually do. They do a supermarket sweep of the world's religions and try to work out which one's best for them. And the amazing thing in this is that they should say Islam seems to be the fit, because particularly for a woman, Islam is the worst imaginable fit. So I think this is less about the attraction of Islam, attractions though there are, but I think it's less about that than it is about why, when they reach out seeking for meaning, do the Christian churches not give them a meaning? And I think there's various reasons for that, and one is, the most obvious is, by any just observer you can tell this, is that the Christian churches seem not to be any longer willing to argue the tenets of their faith. I have a little example of this, which I'll give you, which is I've for some years, on religious discussion programs and so on, seen it as part of my job to demand that the Christian religious leaders at least try to, at some point in the program, defend their own faith. And you'd be amazed at how hard it is to get them there. I had a very, very good example, if I may, from some time ago, when a bishop, a former bishop, who I actually know and I like very much, called Richard Harris, former Bishop of Oxford, very much on the liberal wing of the church. Not, I think, in the Church of England that there's anything much other than a liberal wing, but he gave a speech in the House of Lords in which he said that he thought at the next coronation, the next king in Britain, there should, among other things, be readings from the Quran. And the BBC Today programme phoned me up knowing that I might have a view about this. And I came on the next day, and sure enough, we had Richard Harris and I had two-way discussion. But it took, much as I admire him, it took the whole course of the interview until at the very end, Bishop Harris said, no, I'm not arguing for anything syncretic. Now, I reckon of the listeners, smart though the listeners to the Today programme on the BBC every morning are, fewer than 1 in 10 would understand what he was talking about when he was talking about the syncretic. So it was like the least divisive way he could find to say that he wasn't saying that all the religions are basically the same and it doesn't matter. You have Islam, you have Judaism, you have Christianity, you have Hinduism, you do yoga. Let's just say the whole thing's mindfulness. And I was just, it was only one example of it, but it was very striking to me because I just thought, basically, you're a bishop, your job should be to say, I mean, look, he could argue it this way. We have a large Muslim population in our country, and they, among other minority populations, might like to be in some way represented at the next coronation without only being defender of the faith, defender of the Anglican Church, and so on. Let's find a way to do that. By the way, I still believe in the Trinity, the virgin birth, and the resurrection of Jesus. But other people don't believe in that, so we'll find a way to nod to them. That would mean a totally plausible and decent and tolerant, really inclusive, all the right things. That would be a totally inclusive and decent argument to make. But he wasn't willing to make it. He was willing only to move in the direction of the syncretic. And I think this is an example, a tiny example, an anecdote of the trend that makes these young women, when they not reach out for Christianity. Because I'm not a big fan of like hardline Christianity as it has sometimes existed throughout history. However, if you're not willing to argue your own side in an argument about faith, you shouldn't expect very many people to come into your boat. And like, if you basically don't think you should have a boat, you're not going to get passengers.
No, I totally agree with you that it's a huge problem that Islam has no competition, so to speak, from any other religion. And here, of course, I mean Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Judaism seeking many more
No, but
followers.
I mean, Christianity could say, well, we don't hate you, and it's fine that you're here, but we definitely do not agree with who is God. So let's talk about who is God. And try to make them understand that God is somebody else than what they believe.
Well, that's always been why I've always been, I think, more cynical than anyone else I know on the issue of interfaith dialogue, as it's called. Because the religions put a lot of faith in interfaith dialogue.
It's a waste of time.
It's a total waste of time because what always happens is that the Christians and the Jews agree that there was they agree on half of the Bible. The Jews and the Muslims discover they have some similar dietary requirements. The Christians and the Muslims agree on the existence of the historical Jesus. And then everyone goes home happy after a sandwich lunch. And I think the fantastic frivolity of the whole thing is, yes, if you want to bring religious leaders together to try to make sure everyone gets on, absolutely fine. I mean, like, no one wants war and conflict. But if you stick the faiths together, all they can do is deal with frivolities like dietary requirements, because everything meaningful they disagree on, otherwise they wouldn't be different religions. I mean, if the Christians and the Muslims, instead of saying that they agree on the historical Jesus, and it's so very moving that we recognize the importance of Jesus in both of our traditions. Yes, the important thing is not that you agree on Jesus in both traditions, but that you disagree about the nature of him being the Messiah in Christianity, or that in the Islamic version he doesn't get crucified and rise again. I mean, that's the main issue in the story. It's absurd to avoid that one. But that's what all of that sort of mush is about, and why it's such a waste of time. But no, I just think that, as I say, the churches there are exceptions to this, obviously, but the churches are very unwilling to hold their own side in an argument and to explain and expound their doctrine. The one thing you can be absolutely certain about, if you go to any particularly Protestant church or derived from Protestantism church, like the Church of England, the Church of Sweden, is that if you are to get a sermon, it will not be defending the doctrine of the faith. It will be about the importance of basically looking after the planet, or nice stuff. But it's like the Green Party praying. It's not anything much more meaningful than that. And I think that probably a lot of people have noticed what I at one point in the book explain on this, which is that it's possible just that those churches no longer believe in their own message, but that they're still there. And much like a charity that's been set up in order to cure a disease, when it cures the disease, as sometimes, thank goodness, happens, that charity almost never actually dissipates and closes. They always find a way to remain. They become like the charity to look after people who used to once have that disease. Because things don't actually they don't self-end. They don't say, okay, we have all these buildings, we have all these schools and institutions and things, but let's call it a day. And that's why, as I say, the Church of Sweden is a particularly striking example. They're basically a social justice warrior church, as far as I can see.
But the more we speak about this topic, I realize that this is the core of the problem. So it also means that if we have this void, politics cannot save us only.
No, of course not.
So what are we supposed to do about this void, in your opinion? How can we help it? How can we fill it in with our own traditions, our own values, our own faith? What does it take? Because it's clear that it's evident that politicians won't be able to fix it just by making some more regulations and closing the borders and all these things. It's not enough, because it is within us. The disease is within us, and we are attracting Islam because of our emptiness. So how can we help that?
Well, this is a very important question, and it'll differ from individual to individual. Let me give you my best shot. I think people should be encouraged to live, breathe, and engage in the best of what got them to what they like now. So, if there are things you identify now that you intuit that they have something in them like meaning, and that could be a lot of things. It could be music, for instance. Why are you moved by certain types of music? Music, by the way, is a fascinating one on this, because it's rather like a lot of religion. It speaks in a language which nothing else can approach. It's why you have music. It's like why you have poetry. It's a form of language that no other form of language can do. So find the things that you most intuit seem to have something about them, and pursue it and live within it and see what happens. See where your feet take you.
So you have to focus on what is meaningful in your life.
Without doing that, what the hell are you doing?
But there are so many distractions. You can go on Facebook and you can enjoy yourself. And there's so many distractions. So you won't get into what is meaningful in your life, because you are distracted all the time, or you're entertained by somebody.
Let me give an example of, you're exactly right, but this is something we have to train ourselves, and certainly train the next generation to be better at avoiding. Let me try this example. If you spend a day reading 100 blog posts, fine bloggers as there are out there, if you spend a day reading a dozen different takes on some recent event, how sure are you that you wouldn't have spent a day better reading a great masterwork of literature which you've never read before?
But that's demanding. That's the problem.
Well, of course, because everything that's rewarding is demanding. Let me give you another example from music. Pop song lasts for 3 to 4 minutes. You listen to it and you get it straight away. You will not spend the rest of your life listening to that song. Because, my own experience, you kind of crack it within 4 to 5 listenings. You don't need much more. You've got everything you need from it. That's not the case with Mahler's Second Symphony. You don't listen to Mahler 2 or 3 times, 4 or 5 times, and go, yeah, I kind of got that. Yeah, I've done Mahler 2. No, it's like, my best example from poetry is with T.S. Eliot, who's one of my heroes, idols. Eliot, if somebody said to you, have you read T.S. Eliot? And somebody said, yeah, I've done Eliot. You think, you're a fucking fool. I mean, you are a blistering idiot. Yeah, I did it once, and yeah, I kind of got it. No, this isn't something this isn't something you do. It's something you live with. Always. All the time. From the very first moment you've started to absorb it. Because it'll come back to you again and again throughout your life. Like everything else that's important. It doesn't disappear, you don't get bored of it. You live with it, it becomes part of you. And if we remind ourselves that, sure, we've always been distracted, we're eminently distractible beings. We're very good at being distracted. Eliot says somewhere about the nature of modernity, remember he says, distracted from distraction by distraction. But if you recognize that, then you have to train yourself and train the next generation to know that that's fine. It's not like the whole of our existence shouldn't be a perpetual deep dive into meaning, but we should know and be able to train ourselves to know better how our time could be better spent. Certainly.
So we have to focus on our culture, what is already in our culture.
Well, I'm saying that culture's a pretty good place to go to because there's a reason why it's existed and exists still. It's like there's a good reason why some of the buildings in this city we're sitting in are still here. People didn't get bored of them. They didn't invent a better type of building or one that everyone unanimously thought, yeah, we'd much rather have that. It's still there because for centuries people thought that the building was a success story, found it as something that gave them awe, made them feel awe, gave them inspiration. That's just a building, and not just a building, but a great building is a pretty good place to start with that. But with literature and music and indeed I would say elements of religion, you have the same thing. Like other people before me found meaning in this. I may find meaning here too. That's probably better than trying to break out to find some totally new thing, whether in some...
Well, we tried that. It didn't really work.
Well, it never does because what's worked before is highly likely to work again. And our unwillingness to consider that is, we're not the first people to have that vanity, I might say.
The last question is about the future of Europe, because I see 2 possibilities. One is that we become, or we are re-Christianized, we go back to our roots, we find our faith, and we build ourselves up again, all that we lost. The other possibility is that Europe is becoming Islamic. We're simply, we're losing because that we are no more speaking the religious language, and another religion will take over. And then Europe will become Islamic, like some of the other Christian cultures we have seen through history, like the Byzantine,
Asia Minor.
and North Africa. They're all Islamic today. They were very rich Christian cultures, so why not Europe? What do you think the future of Europe looks like? Because I forgot to mention that I don't believe that there is a secular way where we can just live together, all of us. I think religion will decide the future of Europe.
It could be. I think we have to be humble in our expectations of. I think we have to be humble about our own abilities to foresee anything very much. Churchill said in his magnificent eulogy to his political opponent, Neville Chamberlain, in the House of Commons in 1940, Winston Churchill in that eulogy said, "It's not given to men happily for us, for otherwise life would prove intolerable, to foresee or to predict to any great extent the unfolding course of events." And I think we have to have some humility about that, because very rarely does one predict something and it happens in the way you expected. I remember saying some years ago to a friend that some things that were happening suggested to me that there would probably be a return of Puritanism. And I remember this friend saying, "You can't possibly wish for that." And I said, "Well, no, I don't entirely wish for it, but a little bit of me wants a little bit of Puritanism." And I mention this only because the version of Puritanism that has come in is one I couldn't have predicted, which is the odd microaggression, censorship, weirdo culture that the far left has been pushing. Like, that is basically a type of Puritanism. It's just one I would not have predicted to have come about. I wouldn't have predicted it from that direction. So I think that it needs some humility in all of our predictions about the course of events. Sometimes things just rub along really messily for a long, long time, and you never get to a point of clarification. But your scenarios you paint, I could certainly see them both as possibilities. I think the Islamic scenario is definitely possible. It would come about by an ever larger increase of the Muslim populations in Europe, an increase in conversions, the innovation of other faiths, or the ongoing innovation of other faiths, the slow incremental step into the political and all other discussions of the Islamic worldview, endless concessions to that as if it were what it says it is, and that I could see that happening on a day-by-day basis in a way that most people just got used to. So it doesn't require some kind of apocalyptic change. I mean, I've seen myself in the last 15 years the incremental stepping into all religious discussion in Europe of an Islamic point of view. I mean, maybe that's inevitable if the population continues to grow at the rate it has, and it doubled in the UK in the last decade, it'll double in this one. But that introduction, that didn't used to happen in the 90s. Every religious discussion didn't have to have an Islamic point of view put into it. It wasn't seen as being a useful source to go to for explanations of anything. And now it is. So yes, that could happen continuously, incrementally, and could eventually be what we've become. And yeah, many historical examples of places where, well, the Middle East is the most sad example now, because outside of Israel, a couple of small communities elsewhere, Christianity is basically disappearing in the continent which gave it birth. And another attack the other day in Egypt on the Coptic Christian community. Again, I've seen some of that up close. Yeah, that's possible.
And what about the re-Christianization? Do you believe in that?
I think I've thought about it a lot. I do think it's possible. I think we could disagree on whether secularism has a long shelf span. I think it could, under very specific situations, which we get into. But the re-Christianization, I think, is also possible. But it wouldn't be possible if, to go back to our discussion about Welbeck's character's appearance in front of the Black Madonna in Submission, it wouldn't be possible, first of all, if Christians continued to think that non-believers simply aren't trying. And I think that's something Christianity has gone through before. I mean, you know, that one of Locke's treatises, I think the treatise on religious tolerance, Locke goes into that question about forcing faith, you know, and I think that's something that's worth returning to, for believers to return to just try to work their way through that as well. I think remembering that the churches have gone through this before of, you know, given that some people appear not to believe, what is our attitude towards them? Because the optimal thing could not be that we, as it were, encourage them to lie. Because it wouldn't work in the eyes of God, and it wouldn't work temporally either.
What do you mean with that non-believers are not trying? You mean trying to come closer to the idea of faith?
Well, what I mean is just that there is a strand of Christian thought which seems to me, yes, thinks that those of us who don't believe haven't tried hard enough, or have some reason for not wanting to do it that we could be argued out of. I'm humble enough on this question, at least, to say there may be something in that, but I think it would be. I think when I hear that tone from believers, I think you're not doing your own argument enough service. If you want to understand things as close to being as close to the totality of a thing as possible, you've got to concede that it's not that the secular, it's not that the non-believers are being stubborn in some way. It's that we've discovered an awful lot in recent centuries, which the religious should themselves be somewhat humbled about, and have had to adapt their own views of their own faith about as well, and therefore, having come to different conclusions, the best way to approach those people again is to concede that has happened. The one way I can see where you would bypass that, where rationalism would not be at the root of what you describe as a re-Christianization, would be after catastrophic events after which or during which people reached out to the memory of the place where their ancestors found the ultimate answers. I think of that famous Father Brown phrase. Do you know the Chesterton stories? Mm-hmm. There's the famous one actually which Waugh cites in Brideshead of the twitch upon the thread. You know that one that Father Brown describes as somebody can go to all the ends of the earth, but that God, with one twitch upon the thread, calls them back home. And I think it would require, as I say, a catastrophic set of events, a war, something like that, to get people to leapfrog their rational objections to the religion of their origins and go running back home. I think it's possible. I did know people who started going to church again after 9/11, which was an extraordinary reaction if you think about it. I know people in Britain who did that. And I'm sure there was a little bit of it elsewhere. Now that's quite a striking thing to do after 3,000 people are killed in New York.
But isn't it sad that it has to take a catastrophe for people to start coming back to the faith? I wish it would be a more
well, of course you do.
events.
Yeah, of course you do.
That would make people come back to
Of course you do, but I mean, the alternative is that the churches were just so attractive that they started attracting people back to them without that. I just don't see that. But to return to this point, my point is that there would have to be basically a complete desolation for people to be willing to say, I'm willing to put my faith in that. Because that whole thing, the famous leap of faith, I mean, I read Kierkegaard again recently, and Fear and Trembling, and it's so interesting, that whole issue about the leap. And it probably is, in the end, and this is again something which the secularists will miss, it is in the end almost certainly an emotional thing which kicks it off. Probably doesn't happen in the field of what we think of as rationalism, although rationalism can help get you there. I think it probably, to go back to the Black Madonna, I think that if the character in Welbeck's novel had himself been at a greater moment of desolation, perhaps he would have flung himself in front of the Madonna and said, in any case. In other words, that he would give the sign to the Madonna rather than the Madonna giving the sign to him. I wonder. So, by that note, I really want to thank you for your time today, Dr. Mary. It was a great pleasure. And it's a pleasure. Let's keep fighting the good fight. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.